Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the third in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Transcending Separation from the Hsueh discourses. This lecture is available in written form in Bodhi Ocean, an ebook that is available on the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the lectures page. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website or on our YouTube channel. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com. And on our website, you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He's a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome to the call Richard Harvey. Hello, Richard. Good to be with you today. This lecture, it speaks of two stories. One being the empty boat, the other being the Jesus dictum of turning the other cheek. And you open the lecture with a beautiful parable of the empty boat. And it goes like this. If a man is crossing a river and an empty boat collides with his own skiff, even though he be a bad-tempered man, he will not become very angry. He sees a man in the boat, clear. If the shout is not heard, he will shout again, and yet again, and begin cursing. And all because there is somebody in the boat. Yet if the boat were empty, he would not be shouting and not angry. If you empty your own boat, crossing the river of the world, no one will oppose you. No one will seek to harm you. That's how the parable ends. But then you go in commentary the following, quote, when someone makes you angry, you give them your power. When some circumstance draws a reaction from you, You let some part of yourself go. When things go wrong in your life and you become frustrated or resentful, you lose yourself to negative emotions. End quote. And so my question, Richard, is what is it about the emotion of anger that is so revealing?
It's a lovely question. Two thoughts about anger. One is it's a buffer. It's a covering. It's a covering for a deeper feeling. There is a way of looking at this whereby you go down through layers of, for example, anger, sadness, fear, and then a deeper level of anger. But most usually what's accessible to people when they are feeling emotion is the first thing is a lid or a buffer. And the lid or the buffer is almost some form of anger, irritation, annoyance, even depression. Now, if you can recognize that, then you can help by being with somebody to relieve them or allow them to feel or beneath the more genuine or deeper experience of sadness or fear, for example. So that's the first thing about anger. And the second thing about anger, which I think is in this wonderful story, The Empty Boat, is that you're only angry when you have something to protect, something you're defending against. If there's nobody there, if you're aware of the egoic processes and not identified with the egoic processes, then there's an emptiness. The boat, this vehicle of light, consciousness, isn't full. You're happy because you can experience, you can invite the world into this emptiness. There's not somebody there who's waiting to fight back or waiting to be insulted or waiting for some kind. The Empty Boat is one of the lovely Chengzu stories that very simply gives us an image. Yourself as a vehicle. Yourself as a vehicle that can be filled up and then enticing or inviting or relating to the world through that fullness, which is negative. You know, we learn that from Taoism, these wonderful kind of reversals of things, the negativity of fullness, you know, the positivity of emptiness. And this is what it is. Empty is positive because through emptiness you can let the world in and you can relate to others, not from...
Shortly after the introduction, you share a very interesting commentary on freedom. Particularly relevant in the context of transcending separation and realizing freedom. You say, quote, "We all crave freedom, but freedom is not license. Freedom is not the opportunity to indulge ourselves to the extreme, to stoke our appetites and cravings, and cast ourselves down from the glut in exhaustion. Freedom is not license because license is following the objects of desire and fear, and these objects are inexhaustible. You must align yourself with something else, something more fruitful, fulfilling, and ultimately desirable in order to be free. There is one way, and it is through releasing attachments, because attachments are enslavement. They can a prison of contraction and limitation in which you may become scarcely human." End quote. And my question, Richard, is, do you equate freedom with responsibility? And if yes, responsibility for what?
I don't know if I equate freedom with responsibility. It's a deep question. It perhaps would be a wonderful discussion, wouldn't it? To align and relate those two ideas, or those two realities, that of freedom and responsibility. But I would say that in freedom lies responsibility of the deepest kind, and that you respond to life, responding to fear, desire, even duty, Obligation in the earthly sense is a certain kind of responsibility, but ultimately your freedom lies in your being, what it is you are, not what it is you adapt to. Your adaptive world, time and space, is full of rotations and fears and desires and assumptions and existence. Because, of course, all those things will and can, even in the lifetime, be taken away in a variety of ways. But to center yourself, which is unassailable, in the sense cannot touch it, cannot affect it, cannot remove it, or in any way alter it, for you to be there, is a different kind of responsibility. Response to reality is a response to authenticity, and ultimately, of course, to the divine domain in which your being is continuous with all other beings. So that's the big one. It's huge, and since freedom lies in that truth, responsibility is also, responsibility is perhaps the verb, or the what is it, the call to action, so to speak. Become responsible in the deepest, most active, real sense, in order to be free.
Beautiful. In the lecture of your early experience with co-counseling, in the context of its, quote, new call for self-regulation and emotional expression. And you talk about the times being children of post-World War generation of, quote, suppressed feelers. This was the time. And you talk about these times as one of being a great catharsis for those who embraced the human potential movement of those days. And my question, Richard, is, do you think the need for, quote, suppressed feelers and, quote, to release their emotions is as great today as back in the days you first experienced the co-counseling environment you spoke?
Yeah, it's a sociological study, and it's one that I'm not capable of. It was a different feeling. The 1970s, through decades, as you'll probably have some years on you, but you've lived through decades. As straightforward as the 60s, the 80s, because there's a kind of overlap. But there's a very different feeling. So this feeling of the 70s, looking back now, is really quite tinny and naive and simplistic in some ways, certainly simple and open and innocent and all rather lovely, really, although it seemed rather complicated and mysterious and secretive and weird and unknown at the time. I'm one of these people who stumbled in, I think many people do, we all stumbled into something that later on people wrote about, and you go, oh, I didn't know that, I was in the human potential movement. It's the same as when I was a teenager, and then I saw some history book in a library 15 years ago, and it turned out I was a hippie and I was this, something. I mean, nobody knew this at the time. You had to be in one of these compartments, so to speak. But we were exploring, and we had a great need, which we didn't know about, which is the weirdest thing, to feel and to express them. And then when you did cathart, as I've written this story here and there because it's life-changing for me, and I just want to let people know about it, that everything changes. It's like, you've gone into a different room. It's like the Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe story. Go in the wardrobe and here's a different world. And the need for it was extraordinary, at least in England, because we were the children of the post-World War military generation. Your father was in the World War in the RAF or the Navy or in the Army or something, and then they came back and they drank a lot and they didn't talk about it, and they, got a bit hard and wanted you to play football, and, in my case, you didn't want it. But there was an overwhelming need, and what was extraordinary is we didn't know, but when we found out, there was nothing you could do. It would change your life. It changed the life of thousands of people. almost overnight, let us say. And of course, already kind of second-hand. The whole thing went down again, kind of got quashed, really. And the vibrancy and the potent, and I say all this quite to be objective about it, but I don't experience anything new. You know, when I'm talking to someone or emailing with people on this, I'm a emotional freedom technique therapist, or I'm a blah blah therapist, or I do this, or doing all these things in one weekend, able any of these things. But we just did all these things because we were given it. We were exposed to it by these, I don't know, pioneers, I suppose. Most of whom knew what they were doing because it was so incredibly esoteric. What else could you do? And I think that the 80s is essentially repressive sort of time when, to some degree, the alternative therapies, the new therapies, humanistic influence, unfortunately, and made more superficial, didn't have the edge. And I think today when I meet people, I have to get over, remember, that they weren't there. You know, they weren't there in the 70s and the first part of the 80s when there was this kind of cowboy movement of adventuring and exploring and going over new terrain and, you know, laying new territory and all of this by way of saying, yes, as far as I can see, it is at least people I meet, people I work with, groups and individuals and couples. What I learned in the 70s is usually a revelation to them. I do, of course, work with some people as old as me who were there too. Strangely enough, very often they see much of it as well. Maybe I missed some of it, I don't know. But as far as I can see, it's in a sense been on hold, and it's as utterly relevant today as it was then. From Harvey Jenkins, who was the founder of reevaluation and co-counseling, these movements, and humanistic psychology, personal growth, consciousness raising groups, all these things we were learning in those days in order to cathartic, in order to express freely how we felt, so that the emotional life became at par with the mental, as it was then. Yeah.
You then go on to lead the listener and the reader into an interesting inquiry with the following statement about, quote, divine ignorance. And you share the following, quote, the ego is really only one perspective on the world, one way of looking from one direction, one take on life. A musician listens to music from the point of view of a musician. A music fan, without any technical knowledge, listens from a different perspective. When a disciple meets a saint, he falls at his feet in spontaneous devotion. When a pickpocket meets the same saint, he sees an opportunity to ply his trade. Can anything be fixed and therefore categorized meaningfully or labeled with any accuracy or descriptive truth? Can anything really be understood? No, isn't it true that life, the whole of life, is really a mystery, an extraordinary mystery, unexplained and unexplainable? This spiritual practice is mine ignorance. I do not know what anything really is. End quote. And my question to you, Richard, is what are the imps and or gifts of living in divine ignorance?
You become endlessly fascinated. Let me tell you a story of going back, rather incurring on the last question in some ways. I came from a group one day, one of many, and I came out to my house, and I was living in a house in Harrow, which is near London, and I had a desk, and I had a wardrobe, I had a hook on the door, I had a bed, and I was sharing a house with 3 other people, maybe to lie down after a long weekend of inner exploration, all of this. And I sat at the desk briefly, and I remember picking these things up in wonder, I didn't understand them. I was picking, this is a rubber, I was picking up things, just, I couldn't get rubber, and I couldn't get the concept of any of these things. and I was like a child. And it was completely unexpected, and I looked at the door and there was some complex technology there with the dressing gown, you know. Everything was strange and full of wonder, and at that point I couldn't my shoelaces, I couldn't have made a cup of tea, I couldn't have put a pillow in a pillowcase. It was all just wondrous and extraordinary. And that, I think, is divine ignorance, is knowing, is somehow finding a place where you act stupidly. I mean, there's times when you may need to use the mind in order to do which is strategies for bringing about creative things for our comfort, or to feed or clothe or whatever ourselves, and or these kinds of things. But you can retain the sensitivity and the mindset that says ultimately what any of this is. And I don't know what the number 5 is. I don't know what an apple is. I don't know what empirical means. Who's Wittgenstein? What is a book? You know, where's the clock, and why does the clock say what time it is, or any of these things which we don't, once we finish being children, we don't tend to do the why thing. I mean, why does the clock tell the time? It doesn't tell the time. It's because we adapt to these symbols. Wonderful thing with technology, with this scrolling thing, I sometimes feel dyslexic and it says up or down and I get it wrong, and then I think, oh, actually it's a convention. You know, the computer is telling me how to do these things, and then I conform, much the same as roads and railways and all of these sort of left-brained creation. So the enrichment of divine ignorance, other than the fact of the truth of it, is that you don't tend to introduce a veil of concepts over life. You know, I'm talking to Robert. Am I? You know, I mean, there you are, an attractive man with a beard in Ottawa. I mean, what does it mean? Am I, or am I talking to myself? Or in our case, is there any difference? And so on. So divine ignorance will take you to that place which is, in a sense, antithetical to the left brain strategies of creativity in your life on the practical plane, but it is a very practical way of instilling consciousness into the mystery.
I want to close the interview today with one other inquiry and question. You closed the lecture with what I think, relative to the lecture itself, the ultimate question. And you ask, in the end, perhaps the question is, how may I empty my boat? How can I turn the other cheek, in reference to the other story of turning the other cheek that was inherent in the lecture? How can I turn the other cheek sincerely and authentically? End quote. And so I ask you, Richard, empty their boat, and how does one turn the other cheek sincerely and authentically?
Loss, and more loss. This is working with attachments. What we have is attachments, patterns, assumptions and expectations and beliefs that conform really to our survival strategy. It's relevant, no doubt, to the first 3-4 years of life, but not to later at all. And almost universally, certainly in the West, or in the Western mindset, that in the ways in which we behave and relate, and the way, if you're spiritual, release yourself, identify the attachments, ask yourself how you're holding on, ask yourself, thirdly, what you have to let go of. How am I holding on? What do I have to let go of? These ones. And if you keep pursuing those, emptier, releasing yourself of attachments, it's all loss. It's all you in the way. And ultimately it's you releasing the inauthentic or the counterfeit you in order to see what remains. And I mean, clearly whatever remains, once you've exhausted your attachments and is whatever's there that's natural, shall we say. The natural being or the natural flower that you have done, as of course you know very well, is made a point of distinguishing the psychological from the spiritual, not because essentially there is any difference, but because in order to release yourself of the attachments and practice this practice of loss, you need to understand structures and not to confuse it anyway with spirituality. It's a million miles from devotion, a spiritual discipline that you never relieve yourself. You have no. So these sadhana, meditation, contemplation, and many other genuine, real spiritual methodologies are distinguished in my teaching from psychological practices and methodologies for the simple reason that if we confuse them, it has been difficult for us in the human evolution of consciousness over the 100 years, and that is when we're working deeply psychologically ourselves into an exalted state of the first rung of the spiritual ladder on any spiritual ladder. That's inevitably an egoic concern. There's no progress. There's nothing of this relative world involved in spirituality. And the trouble is then we never really get to what the divine is really all about. We never get to understand it. We never get to even talk in poetic, sacred, symbolic ways that actually make any sense. We're forever transferring psychological to its spiritual place, which it isn't, and it can never be. So release ourselves from the ego forces. Ego is delusion. Ego is not an entity. Ego is not a self, is not a being, is not a becoming. It's merely a resistance to life. It's merely your personal contraction. It's dynamic. It's active. It's not a thing. So in order to no longer be detachments, practice loss and to see what remains.
Beautiful way to end our interview today, Richard. Thank you very much. I look forward to continuing with these Hsuan discourses, interviews. They're a wonderful group of lectures. So thank you for today. And
in a fortnight. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.